Hello and welcome to the Unit 3 overview for Metro 101. Unit 3 includes Chen's chapters 9 through 12 and Clay's look at sinks and turf. We begin Unit 3 by examining post-war inequality and diversity. Now, to put our a framework around this time period, we're looking at the time after World War II when we started to see the global economy emerge. And during this time, we saw an increase in inequality, we saw an increase in poverty, we saw an increase in segregation between social groups, economic groups, and racial groups. The economic decline and the growth of the suburbs set the stage for some interesting trends that were happening in our cities. The first trend we'll look at is gentrification, and gentrification came about because of this economic decline. When we talk about gentrification, we're looking at both the physical and social transformation that takes place in neighborhoods. Oftentimes, we confuse gentrification with economic development, but as we'll see, for gentrification to take hold, we need to have that social transformation and the physical transformation. The physical transformation often occurs in the form of economic development, physical improvement to the neighborhood, bringing back local businesses, local shops and restaurants. The social transformation comes with both pros and cons. We often look at displacement of the initial group that's in the area as a new group from outside of a higher socioeconomic class moves in. So while gentrification for a city may be a positive when we look at it in terms of economics, there are some social concerns with displacement. As the new group comes in, they change that sense of place. As that new group comes in, they oftentimes make that community more expensive. So we see displacement through both the social means, because your community is changing and your sense of place is changing, and we see displacement through an economic means as a place becomes more expensive to live. Your property taxes increase, your rent increases, your cost of consumer goods increase. So gentrification is a very complex topic, and again, it's important to recognize both the pros and cons. And within the Chen readings and within the articles linked in the lecture, you'll see some of these complexities play out, where people in gentrifying communities see it as a positive, where others within these communities see it as a negative. We're going to look at the evolution of immigrant enclaves and how these are different than the ones we found in the first half of the 1900s. Immigrant enclaves reflect what's known as transnational landscapes. You're probably familiar with Chinatowns, Little Italies, Little Havanas. So oftentimes in our newer communities are called ethnoburbs, as these immigrant enclaves have spread out of the downtown areas. So in the post-war period, we see the increased diversity with our immigrant enclaves. And keep in mind this idea of transnational landscape. It's something that we often come across, but we might not recognize, we might not focus our attention. So a transnational landscape is simply a cultural landscape that's formed by two or more unique cultures. So immigration drives the growth of these transnational neighborhoods, as we have a Portuguese or an Afro-Caribbean or a Eastern European enclave emerge in the United States, and as it emerges, it blends both its home culture and the culture in the United States. And then in this unit, we're also going to look at the growth and the establishment of LGBT communities. June is Pride Month, and we're going to take a look at why and where a lot of these LGBT communities formed. The idea of inequality and diversity really grabs hold to LGBT communities. We're coming up on the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, and the Stonewall riots just over 50 years ago really set the stage for increased tolerance, really set the stage for increased acceptance, really reduced a lot of barriers and a lot of punitive measures that were in place for this community that required this community to segregate to certain parts of our cities. Whereas today, as we are moving into the 2020s, we see that many of these stigmas are no longer in place. We see our LGBT community still fight for equal rights, gain equal rights, but we're seeing the importance as these highly segregated LGBT communities begin to wane. In the next chapter, chapter 10, we're going to look at power, authority in cities as contested spaces. And this is a really interesting chapter. And we move into this idea of contested spaces by building on some of the topics we covered in our LGBTQ neighborhoods. The idea of contested space is that we have a marginalized group fighting for its position in an area that's secured or empowered by a dominant group, and we're going to see how this takes hold in a number of ways. The LGBT communities that were discussed in Chapter 9, those ideas will be reintroduced. We'll look at a global example of contested space in the form of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the most contested city in the world, and we're going to see how the different Abrahamic or Semitic faiths come together and converge on that space, and they all compete for their own viability. They all compete for their space within the old city of Jerusalem. So we'll see how Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and also the Eastern Orthodox or Armenian form of Christianity all fight for space, all fight for control within Jerusalem. It's really a fascinating city. And we could liken some of these ideas of contested space to what's happening in the United States today. Over the last couple of months, you're certainly familiar with a lot of the movements, a lot of the protests that are going on across the United States, and a lot of these involve the presence of Confederate statues or Confederate memorials or the celebration of these figures. And what we're finding is that these places are becoming targeted for removal. These places are becoming more and more contested as we try to move away from celebrating these figures that were really representative of a dark time in American history. So the idea of contested space is happening. Oftentimes we need to train our eyes to really understand it, but keep this in mind as we go through. We have these global cities like Jerusalem. We have these movements that are happening outside of our door. Keep in mind the connection between our marginalized groups and our groups in power when we examine contested spaces. The clay topic of turf will probably come to light when we look at contested spaces. You'll start to recognize the links between Chen's view of contested spaces and Clay's application of turf. Within this chapter, we also look at the city's many roles. Part of it is a regulatory force, and we'll see again how that plays into contested spaces and marginalized communities. Other parts of it is revenue, and as our economy has shifted over the last 50 years, we see our cities, in an attempt to provide more services, try to grow their tax base and their revenue streams. So we'll see how things like charging for parking, charging fees or usage fees for parks, how this also becomes part of a contested issue. In the second half of Unit 3, we're going to shift gears and we're going to go abroad. We're going to start our look in the developing world and see really the rapid growth of our cities. The idea of over-urbanization is going to come into play. You've likely seen pictures, read stories, seen video of some of our most densely populated cities on Earth, and we're finding these cities rapidly grow in the developing world. Over-urbanization simply means that people are migrating into these cities much faster than the cities can accommodate. So the cities can't provide jobs in the formal sector. Housing isn't available in the formal market, either through simple supply and demand or cost. So over-urbanization, this concept is really important when we understand what's happening in our developing world cities. We're going to look at some of our mega cities and see the pros and cons. So while we're seeing an expansion or increased separation between wealth and poverty in these cities, as these cities grow larger and more dense, we're also seeing that they remain places of hope. They remain places of opportunity. So while we see a growth of poverty and a growth of slums in a lot of our mega cities, these slums, these rapidly growing areas, still reflect opportunity. So our megacities are really complex. On the surface, they look like places of stark contrast, of really low lows and in some cases, lack of hope, lack of opportunity. But what we're going to find is that that opportunity, the promise of a city, is still attracting people in. And there's a TED Talk on what's known as System D that I think you'll find very interesting. System D is the informal sector. The informal sector grows, again, during over-urbanization, when people moving into a city can't find employment in the formal sector. So we're going to look at different parts of the world where System D, the informal sector, is actually a major contributing economic force. The final chapter of Unit 3, the final chapter of the semester, we're going to look at the global economy, and we're going to look at cities that are emerging in the global economy. We're going to start out by looking at a city called Yuchina, and Yuchina has grown tremendously over the past 30 years. There's an international trade mart located in Yuchina, and this trade mart supplies low-cost goods to vendors across the world. So is really a complex, fascinating place as people from the Middle East, people from Africa, people from Europe arrive in and many of them establish businesses and residencies there, and they stay long term. So while China has the reputation for being a very hostile place to outsiders, ethnic and religious minorities, we're seeing that in a very organic urban area is growing. It's really a fascinating place. Maybe to make a personal connection, as we move towards the end of the calendar year, over 60% of Christmas and holiday decorations are made in So again, these low-cost goods, the home goods, children's toys, low-cost electronics, all these things are made in So I think you're going to find that this place is really a fascinating part of the world. And then we'll look at re-emerging places like Berlin. Berlin was a city that was under communist rule through the second half of the 1900s. And as Berlin re-engaged the global economy, re-engaged the free market, re-engaged democracy, we're seeing that Berlin is becoming one of these cultural meccas located in Western Europe. So Berlin is able to recreate itself. Going back to the idea of contested spaces, right? When we talk about removing statues, Berlin tore down the Berlin Wall, and they've certainly moved past that without erasing that part of history. And then we'll look at a city in the Middle East, a city-state known as Dubai, part of the UAE. And Dubai is rapidly grown on the growth and expansion of its natural resource industry, oil and gas. And what we're finding in Dubai is that the population is made up almost entirely of immigrants and first-generation people, and that the population pyramid in Dubai is really skewed because what we have are thousands and thousands of young men in their 20s and 30s migrating into Dubai from South Asia and the Middle East. So the population dynamic in Dubai is really skewed because of the rapid growth and because of the natural population growth in that part of the world can't sustain the labor need. So we're going to look at the global economy as shifting cities across the world, not only integrating these major cities, but also reducing the existence of regional cities. So our big cities today are all becoming increasingly interconnected and interdependent on other cities, people, places, institutions around the world. And we wrap up clay by looking at sinks and turf. Sinks, I think we're going to be able to tie into some concepts that are included in Chen Chapter 9 when we look at some of our enclave communities, some of our areas that are less desired, and how these are easily found and recognized and sought out in cities. And then we'll also look at turf. Turf is important. We find turf in our everyday lives. Turf shows us who is allowed where. It shows us accessibility or inaccessibility. It shows us identity. Turf oftentimes leads to contested spaces. So there's some good information related to Towson in the lecture slides that I think you'll be able to connect with, and I look forward to seeing your connections with these final topics in Unit 3. So please reach out if you have any questions. Otherwise, we'll be in touch soon, and good luck wrapping up the term.